Hello, everybody, and thank you for once again joining us for the next edition of our Citizen Science webinar series. Just a reminder, we try to host a webinar at least once a month to discuss a program of interest or a topic of interest within the citizen science community at NOAA. Today, we're very excited to have our panel of guests joining us today to talk about this very relevant issue. We have Abigail, the program analyst from NOAA Fisheries, Laura, our education program manager with NOAA Fisheries, as well as Jeffrey, the data product manager with ECS Federal supporting NOAA Fisheries. They're going to be discussing our topic today, and I'll turn it over to them.
Okay, well, thank everyone for tuning in today. As Rebecca mentioned, we're going to be talking about how citizen science can support stock assessments. And to kick things off, I think the first thing that's important to do is to define citizen science, since it may mean different things to different people. The definition we call from is from the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act, which is a form of open collaboration in which individuals or organizations participate voluntarily in the scientific process. There are a host of other names and perhaps a debate in the community over what's the right terminology. We do proceed with citizen science, but I think it's also important to recognize that other terms like participatory science, community science, volunteer monitoring may also be used to mean basically the same thing. So again, we define citizen science as individuals or groups voluntarily participating in the scientific process. I think it's also important to recognize that that's not limited to just data collection. It could be analyzing the data or even coming up with the question in side by side with researchers to pursue a scientific project. In terms of citizen science and NOAA and what the landscape is, I think it's important to recognize that there's sort of been an increasing interest and integration of citizen science into NOAA. Beginning in 2017, that was when the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act came out, basically authorizing citizen science as a method that federal agencies could use to conduct research or various projects. But following on that, there's really been an increasing interest. So looking at 2020, citizen science was defined as just a handful of science and technology focus areas at NOAA, side by side with things like artificial intelligence, omics, and data science. Following on that, we developed a NOAA Citizen Science Strategy and Action Plan, which really focused on 5 core areas, which included integrating citizen science into one of the regular streams of methods across the agency that we can use to collect data, building partnerships, and also ensuring data quality. Also following on that, and just looking at the increasing trend, going from 2017, where the first law enacted relating to citizen science, seeing NOAA elevate citizen science to one of its focus areas, and fast forward to now, we have our first ever NOAA Citizen Science funding opportunity under the Inflation Reduction Act. Also looking in terms of citizen science, it really runs along a spectrum. So mentioning at one end of the spectrum would be volunteers contributing data in projects that are generally designed by scientists. Following up on the next rung would be looking at it in terms of a collaborative nature, where volunteers may also contribute data, but do other things like refine project design or analyze data, usually in terms of projects that are designed by scientists. But at the highest rung, there are projects that are co-created in which the volunteers and the scientists work side by side to design the projects. And this comes from Bonney et al. 2009 publication. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Abby.
Thank you, Laura. So we, saw this growing interest in citizen science. It's, getting a lot more promotion, but I think some of us in our program, and I'm in the stock assessment program, wanted to say, well, what does this mean for, the operational science that we actually do as an agency? So at NOAA Fisheries, our products that we do is a stock assessment. So for a brief interview, for those who may be a little less familiar, NOAA Fisheries manages almost 500 fish stocks and stock complexes. We do that through fisheries stock assessments, which are crucial operational science to ensure sustainable fisheries management. We like to say they are both a process and a product, and they form the scientific backbone of sustainable fishing targets in the United States. They're a huge investment. We invest a lot of resources into producing these. We like to have this kind of graphic here that highlights the different phases. So we have, for example, the first phase, which is probably the bulk of our resources are invested here, which is data collection. We collect abundance data. through our scientific fishery independent surveys that go out on ships in the water. We also collect a lot of biological samples that we do in process through, both from the surveys as well as the catch. We catch a lot of life history data that way. We monitor fisheries in the United States for catch monitoring, and that provides, big crucial component of seeing how the population is doing. We also collect a lot of other information like socioeconomic information, ecosystem information. And so these all get fed into our stock assessment models, which are, mathematical models for population dynamics to make predictions on the status of the stock. The results from these then undergo scientific peer review to ensure that we're using the best scientific information available. And those, stock assessment reports are large, transparent documents showing, the results of these models. And then that information is delivered to the fisheries management councils, who use that information to set harvest policy, or what's the catch limits that we are allowed to catch for each fishery. I also want to mention we do this assessments across a spectrum of data levels. We have data-rich stocks with large quantities of all types of the data mentioned here. And we have some stocks we consider data limited that may only have catch data, and perhaps even catch data that is slightly less reliable than we'd like. But we do account for those different types of data levels throughout the various 4 steps in this process. There's ways of dealing with the data complexity. Very briefly, just to mention a couple other factors as we're talking about the U.S. system, we do also have projects we consider complementary to citizen science within the agency. We have cooperative research, which is research done together with the fishing industry. Some of it would be classified as citizen science, some of it, because they may be paid, technically doesn't always fit under the definition. There's a lot of growing interest in the agency in angler reporting, angler apps, a lot of fishermen kind of reporting in real time what they're doing on the water, what they're catching. And also we do collect a lot of data in partnership with state agencies, universities, academia. So, they also participate in all the different steps of these processes. One other brief caveat to mention is, in the U.S. system, fishermen are required to report catch. That may or may not be true of some of the examples we speak to later in international cases, but it is for the U.S. system. So, this is kind of the scientific enterprise that we operate within. And we were thinking, citizen science is getting a lot of attention, but a lot of times it seems to get kind of put within the outreach and education programs. And we wanted to see, well, how does this fit into our scientific operations? So on the next slide, we have our project goals, which are, this kind of work we're doing here as a team, which is, seeing what's the landscape of, do we currently use citizen science in our stock assessments? Then looking at those cases and kind of what are some of the challenges associated with using data from Citizen Science Project, as well as what are potential opportunities that we may not be taking advantage of. And hopefully through this research, being able to produce some best practices and some guidance for the agency. We used a variety of methods to come up with the questions here. We will go into a lot more detail on these later in the presentation, but for a brief overview, there wasn't a good exhaustive list or study, and we kind of realized no one method would give us a comprehensive answer, but through this multi-method approach, looking from a few angles, we hope we could get a decent answer. So we did a couple methods that looked at citizen science projects and then kind of following those projects to see how the data is used, which would include, we did a literature review to find different cases on the topic. We also found project leads at NOAA who run citizen science projects and did interviews with them about how their data is used. And then we also had a couple methods that kind of looked at the end product of the stock assessments themselves and then seeing, what kind of data did they use to produce those. So we did a word search query on stock assessment reports, and we also distributed a survey to some analysts who produce the stock assessments. So all these methods provided a ton of examples of different types of citizen science projects with relevance to marine fisheries. And so I'm going to pass it back to Laura to give us first just kind of some examples of things that we turned up.
Thanks, Abby. So looking at the full landscape of citizen science projects that get into, can support stock assessment or general fishery science and management efforts, there's a range of efforts and methods that can be used. So looking at logbooks is one example, photographs and sightings, which can support things like species identification, presence, and location. Using divers as citizen scientists to conduct visual surveys of various species and habitat types. Volunteers may also provide biological samples ranging from fin clips to otoliths to a project where fish skeletons, which we'll get into momentarily. Tagging programs, although not all of them are citizen science, many do utilize volunteers to tag various types of animals. In one case, sometimes we're retrieving the tags. Former President Bush was actually a citizen scientist in terms of finding a tag at one time. Angler reporting can provide information on discards and catch. Environmental data, which we'll provide an example of, or even, and again, just a reminder that citizen scientists aren't there just to collect data, but they may also analyze the data, where they can annotate images, photos, videos, or even audio files online. So looking at some examples of each, tagging, for example, one prime example is the NOAA Fisheries Cooperative Shark Tagging Program, which is actually NOAA Fisheries' oldest citizen science program, which goes back to 1962. Again, it's a collaborative effort where it involves anglers, the commercial fishing industry, and it's all there to collect more information about sharks in the Atlantic. Data that this program has been able to provide relates to stock identity, abundance, age and growth, mortality, behavior, and movements and migration. And these data have been used to support domestic and international stock assessments, as well as essential fish habitat designations. And just looking at the numbers alone, since 1962, volunteers have tagged over 300,000 sharks of 50 different species, over 18,000 recaptures that have provided data on 30 different species. So, the numbers, sometimes it's just the power of the crowd to produce volumes of numbers on needed data can be very helpful. Looking at another type of example where the citizen scientists were scuba divers. One program where this came into play was a program for Young of the Year rockfish in Puget Sound. In this program, the divers conduct timed roving surveys of Young of the Year rockfish and to get information on the rockfish and the associated habitat to better understand their populations and habitat use. In terms of the data collected, it's rockfish abundance and qualitative habitat data. And what this has been used for is to better understand and predict endangered and threatened rockfishes. And just to kind of give you an example of where this data can be very valuable, the volunteers were able to newly document Young of the Year rockfish in shallow waters between November and February, which hadn't previously been noted in the peer-reviewed literature. So here's another example where volunteers may operate using an opportunistic approach, based on whatever they've collected at any given time or place, providing biological samples. So in this program, Australia's Send Us Your Skeletons programs, anglers voluntarily donate fish skeletons from their catch. They provide information on the date and capture location to the equivalent of NOAA in Australia, the Department of Fisheries. And the data these skeletons provide is biological information on age structures. And to tie that back to stock assessment, the age structures can be an indicator of stock health and aid in conducting stock assessments. Now looking at an example of a citizen science project on the other end of the spectrum, which has more of a systematic-based type of data collection. One example we'll feature here is the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program. In this program, volunteer anglers participate in a collaboratively designed systematic survey of West Coast rockfish. Through this survey, they're able to collect rockfish catch per unit effort, otoliths, fish, representative of fish age, and fin clips for genetic studies. The original application of this program was to monitor California's Marine Protected Area Network and to evaluate the efficacy of these MPAs, but it's also been used to support NOAA fisheries stock assessments. So for example, during COVID closures, when some of our surveys were not able to run, this fishery independent source did provide information on an index of abundance for the California vermilion rockfish. And again, just looking at the sheer numbers of what the crowd can cover, they've encountered over 170 fish of 92 different types of species. So again, moving from the biological to the environmental data spectrum, another program known as EMOLT, short for Environmental Monitors on Lobster Traps and Large Trawlers going back to the 1990s, in this program, commercial fishing vessel captains deploy oceanographic sensors in New England waters. And the objective is to get temperature profiles and bottom temperature information. This, in terms of the data they've collected, it's used to monitor water temperatures. It's fed into ocean forecast models to support sustainable fisheries and other types of maritime decision making. And I also indicate that it was used in the 2020 American Lobster Benchmark Stock Assessment, which provided information on a trawl catchability covariate. Again, looking at numbers, over 50 vessels have transmitted over 23,000 bottom temperatures in real time. The real time connection has come a little bit later, since I think around 2015. And going back to what citizen scientists can do, again, not just data collection, through a platform called Zooniverse, which is an online platform where its volunteers can annotate images, videos, sound clips. Through a project called Ocean Eyes, run out of our Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center, an online crowd review and annotate underwater images from our bottom fish surveys. The data collected is used to localize and identify various types of bottom fish, with the ultimate goal being to train AI tools to automate optical data processing for stock assessment. And through the numbers, over 20,000 volunteers having made over 4 million classifications on over 400,000 images, it saves the time that a normal staff member would have to do to do this alone. So it provides efficiencies in that realm. And the last example I want to call attention to is the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. It's the first and only council to have established a formal citizen science-based program. And not only that, it's driven by particular research needs identified by the council. So some examples of what the projects and efforts that they've already conducted. They've looked at, through a project called Fishery, also using that online Zooniverse platform, they've used historic dock photos between the 1940s and 1980s to document catch and size composition. The name of the project is called Fishery. They've also been able to collect data on reef fish lengths through in particular on data limited species, where the divers were the volunteers through a SMILE project. They've also designed a project portal where anybody can go on there and recommend a project that's tied to a research priority for consideration. And they also had a project that looked at reef fish releases, looking at the length, release treatment, other variables to understand release conditions and numbers. And they did that using an app called SciFish, which has now been expanded as a customizable app for citizen science projects on the East Coast. But again, beyond just conducting citizen science projects, this program is also designed to foster collaboration and trust with the volunteers and stakeholders. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jeff.
Awesome, thank you. I want to take some time here to go through a subset of the results that we've compiled through the variety of methods that we used here. And again, this is just a subset, and I'm really going to focus on speaking to how NOAA Fisheries is using citizen science in its fishery stock assessments. But of course, we're happy to discuss some of the other results that we've compiled either in the questions and answers section of this talk, or feel free to reach out to any of us after the talk is over. And I'll move on to the next slide, please. So the first method that I want to talk through is our literature review. And so we performed a literature review working with the NOAA library, and we used a query search that was run through the Swift Active Screener, which is a platform that you kind of seed with some phrases. And we used a variety of citizen science related phrases to screen for articles, compiled the list that the library pulled together for us in EndNote, and then kind of used that to facilitate our review and additional filtering. So through the end of that process, we were left with a pool of 74 articles covering about 82 cases of citizen science. So that pool of articles and cases was split about evenly between domestic and international cases. And it's important that I mention it included papers focused on freshwater fisheries and other marine species like marine mammals. So this pool isn't exclusively marine fisheries around the world. But regardless, so in the literature review, we read through all of these articles and kind of coded them according to the type of project that was covered or that was done, the data they collected, the level of volunteer training, project goals, design specifications, just to get a full sense for how everything shook out across all of these. And it gave us a really good sense for the landscape of citizen science projects that were out there. It really kind of informed what best practices looked like across various projects. And it really allowed us to explore citizen science impacts as they relate to fisheries. So I'll pop to the next slide and get into a bit more detail here. So in this pie chart, we're going to kind of break that down to look at if and how the data from citizen science projects were ultimately used. So again, this breakdown is a little bit subjective because many of these articles fell outside the context of the Magnuson-Seaton framework used in the United States. So we are kind of applying that framework to some articles that don't quite jive. But regardless, if you look at that top right corner, the three slices of the pie up there that are all in various shades of green captured instances where citizen science projects went on to be used or considered in stock assessments. So that covered roughly a quarter of all the cases that we reviewed, with about 20% of them having some level of use in that final stock assessment model. And we break that down a little bit further into direct uses and partial uses and attempted uses there. In this case, direct uses speaks to things like using tagging data to inform estimates of natural mortality, where there's direct impact on the model. An indirect use would be something like comparing an abundance index produced by citizen scientists to one generated by other NOAA fisheries surveys. So you have that kind of one-to-one comparison, but not a direct incorporation into the model. So on the bottom right corner, that slice covers cases where citizen science data informed fisheries management decisions. And again, that covers about another quarter of the cases and included outcomes where studies provided useful information about things like habitat, angler behavior, or species distributions that ultimately really help to shape management actions about those species. So while again, all those cases cover a broad array of domestic and international settings, we also saw that, about 50% of them had some impact on those ultimate management outcomes, either directly through the scientific stock assessment or through the consideration of fishery managers. But it's important that we talk about the other 50% of these cases, because as you can see, about 10% of cases express no direct connection between citizen science and stock assessments or fishery management. And the remaining 40% provided insufficient information for us to make determinations about the ultimate use of the data. And at least I, for one, found it a bit troubling that this was the largest slice of the pie, as it really kind of suggests that some of these projects really aren't discussing or considering their ultimate uses, impacts, or outcomes once they're completed. So I'll jump to the next slide, please. So I'll pivot now and really talk about a review of stock assessment reports. So stock assessment reports, as Abby mentioned earlier, describe the data, statistical models, results, and processes through which NOAA fisheries conduct stock assessments. So we compiled the latest assessment reports from 261 federally assessed United States fish stocks. We converted them all into readable text and matched them with citizen science terminology using R. Our initial query returned just over 4,000 matches, which we went in to validate and whittled that down to about 318 likely references to citizen science. So I'll kind of get into the breakdown of how those results comes together. But before I move on, I want to ask a question to the audience here, which is, in your head, what proportion of stock assessments do you think referenced citizen science? So to give the answer, Laura, we'll jump to the next slide. So across the 261 reports, we saw that about roughly 40% of them, or 103 assessments, made some reference to a term related to citizen science or its common synonyms, things like participatory research, volunteer participation, local knowledge, so on and so forth. What's interesting here is, as you can see, most matches were terms related to citizen science, but only just a sliver were actually directly mentioning the term citizen science. So I'll go into those in a bit more detail in a moment here, but just, think about your guess, how close you were. I know at least I, for one, drastically underestimated where I thought this was going to come but we'll break it down a little more on the next slide. So let's get into these terms. So here I've sorted those 318 search term matches into 11 general groups. So again, these come from just those 103 assessment reports with the validated references. And some of those reports contain multiple matches to individual terms. But there's two kind of immediate trends that jumped out to me. So you can advance the slide one, Laura. The first was the dominance of tagging studies as a term match across these reports. So tagging involves marking fish with coding tags, releasing them, and then gathering data on the recaptures that occur during fishing activities. And it's really a long used tool. I think Laura mentioned the shark tagging program that goes back to the 1960s. And it's provided a lot of information on fish life histories, including how they move, grow, mature, and die. But something I think that's important to mention in this context is that some tagging studies are not entirely volunteer, and we did not delve into the specifics of each tagging program. So I'll say that while these do represent the lion's share of the cases we matched, it's likely that this is somewhat inflated. So you can advance the slide one more, please. And kind of the second kind of interesting thing that arose is that across this broad array of terms, you can see there's a variety of different terminology used. But again, citizen science really only comes up a couple of times. I think we saw 4 references to citizen science across all stock assessments in NOAA fisheries. So I just want to spend one more slide now talking about the context in which we saw these terms being used. So on this slide, I've broken out this context into references to citizen science and how they appeared in each of the 103 stock assessment reports that we were looking at. So again, stock assessment reports contain details of the data and analysis used to estimate the condition of fishery resources. And in the left pie chart, you can see that about 85% of the 103 assessment documents referencing citizen science did so when describing the data they considered or the data that they used in their most recent assessment. However, most stock assessment documents also provide forward-looking recommendations about new or expanded data, considerations, or analysis that can improve the quality of future stock assessments. Okay, well, in the right pie chart, you can see that roughly 51% of stock assessments, 51% of stock assessments reference citizen science in their research recommendations. And so you can see, again, that citizen science is coming up both in the kind of consideration aspect of these stock assessment reports, as well as the in the forward-looking components of them. Just for a moment, and I have to move along here. I just have to pull up my notes. Perfect. There. All right. So, kind of pivoting and moving forward here to our work with the NOAA Fisheries Citizen Science Project leads. We have a rough database on citizen science projects. It's something of work in progress at this point, but we reviewed that list to identify projects which seems like they might have relevance to marine fish stock assessments. So we identified 16 potential projects and reached out to project leads with set questions for each of them. We got 2 email responses covering 3 projects, but we were able to conduct semi-structured interviews with 10 project leads covering 11 projects. So specifically, I want to highlight the insights that wrong slide, there we go. Specifically, I want to highlight the insights that those interviews provided on how NOAA Fisheries-led citizen science contributed to U.S. stock assessments and fishery management decisions. So what we found, again, was pretty interesting. So looking at the proportion of projects that used citizen science in stock assessments, you can see that 36% use rate is higher than what we saw when looking across the entire landscape of citizen science literature, which was around 25% use rate. So maybe that's not so surprising because these are NOAA Fisheries projects designed with specific target needs, support, and focus areas. So, you know, we're kind of like picking from a select pool here, but and these are even some of the projects that you had heard about earlier in the presentations, such as the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program or the Cooperative Shark Tagging Program. But another thing that came out of those interviews was they were really a nice way or a nice insight for us that provided more direct insight into how citizen science projects were informing management in the United States. Because you can see here that almost 50% of these projects fell under that category where they are informing management. This again included some of the tagging projects that help verify knowledge about stock movement and distributions, or records of anecdotal observations of things like red tides that help scope management decisions. I think it's important that I highlight this area of the interviews here because it's an area where our other methods didn't do as good a job capturing the impacts of citizen science and their use. So it was nice to get a sense for kind of what we might be missing throughout this project. So the final method included in our study was a survey that we distributed to NOAA Fisheries Stock Assessment staff about how they had used or considered citizen science and their views on citizen science data in stock assessments. We distributed this internally via email, and we ended up with 35 responses covering all 6 fishery science centers with a focus in the Southeast and Northeast regions. So this is, again, where I really want to take a targeted look at one of the questions we posed. And in this instance, it's whether those NOAA Fisheries stock assessment scientists had ever considered citizen science data in their stock assessments and the result of those efforts. So again, we have a couple interesting threads here. With the first being that more than half of respondents indicated that they at least had some use or consideration of data provided through citizen science projects. And as you can see, about a quarter of them directly incorporated data into their assessments. Again, examples of that include the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program that we've already mentioned several times, as well as the Shark Tagging Program, or things like salmon escapement that has helped to inform some Pacific salmon assessments. An additional third of the assessment authors who responded to the survey indicated that citizen science data had informed their stock assessments in some way. For example, the Something's Fishy tool in the Southeast helped to contextualize the impact of red tide events on some assessments there. And there are plenty of examples where catch histories provided by fishers and anglers have helped to inform estimates of historic catch in stock assessments. So again, while this is something of a self-selecting group, and is probably not directly comparable to our other results, it nevertheless provides us another data point indicating that citizen science data are undoubtedly being used and considered routinely in stock assessments as well as fishery management in the United States. And with that, I will pass it back to Abby.
Thank you, Jeff. So kind of starting to sum it up here a little bit, just as a reminder, we talked through a lot of examples. We have different examples of where citizen science has contributed, discard information, a lot of information on length frequency, length composition, examples of providing biological samples. You can, with sightings, you can get distribution, habitat preference, aggregations. And as he mentioned, there's even for migratory fish, there's some examples of counting the fish. On the next slide, we have kind of from our literature as well as our survey that we asked this question to the stock assessment analysts, what are places that you see potential uses for citizen science? One of them is just the ability to provide more continuous, frequent observations. We may send our ships out once a year to do a survey, but you could be getting a lot more information throughout the year from citizen scientists, as well as, being able to perhaps provide observations in areas that we do not survey, like near shore or hard to survey areas. We have the example of, increased biological samples, like the send us your skeletons. This is especially useful for stocks that are not caught very frequently. So we may have very few samples, but could provide more examples if fishermen were sending them in. A lot of people recognize the importance of citizen science in providing better picture of the recreational fishery, effort, catch, discards, things like that. We have this example of, crowdsourcing, but I think there's a lot more potential there for, participation, even from your home. You don't have to get out on the water, but doing more image processing. And there's also, literature on the subject of using more traditional knowledge or local knowledge to kind of reconstruct some levels of estimate for historical fishing. And historical fishing, we don't always have a good picture of, but it's a really important element of our time series of abundance for assessments is to have some assessment of historical fishing. So to kind of take a next big picture on the next slide, I'd like to mention a few challenges that came up that people mention often related to citizen science. One is related to spatial or temporal mismatch. Citizen science projects are often localized. They may be one small community that's doing it, and it may be hard to fit that type of information into an assessment that's for a whole coast. And that fitting in those data sets can be a bit of a challenge. Another one relates to poor information about effort. If you want to get abundance information, it's very important to have, not just when you saw a fish or when you returned a tag, but also knowing how many tags were distributed or how many people were out there that might not have reported a fish. And there are ways to deal with this, but sometimes in citizen science, it's challenging to know all the different null values, as we call them, that are out there. The next one kind of relates to the concept of systematic versus opportunistic, which is systematic would be going out, collecting information on a scientific sampling protocol, versus opportunistic is people providing data for things they're already doing, like fishing or diving. Both data can be useful. I mean, there's obviously a preference for systematic, but there is still some utility for opportunistic data. It just is treated very differently when incorporated into the assessment. Another thing here relates to, participation perhaps could be biased towards certain groups or not representative of a whole fishery. So for example, it may be one fishing club or one diving club that's doing this citizen science project, and they may provide really good information, but, it may not be representative of the whole fishery or the commercial fleet or even other diving clubs or other fishing groups that are in the area without that information as well. Another one relates to, the importance of really setting strong scientific protocols. And, we can set those up at the beginning and also just making sure that we know that those protocols are followed throughout the life of the project, that people are handling samples correctly and collecting data correctly. Our next one relates to, data management, which is not unique to citizen science. This is something that we deal with as an agency in general. But obviously, when you're collecting data from lots of different people, there can be challenges there associated with, processing the data, documenting the metadata, how are we storing it, and also the format that that data is being shared. If we ultimately want it to fit into some form of a model, is that data in a format that the analyst can use it, or if they would have to spend a lot of time, kind of cleaning and processing the data. And lastly, kind of mentions, there is actually a lot of logistics and project management that's necessary for successful citizen science projects. It takes a lot of time to recruit and train and do all of these protocols and stuff. So it's, it's not easy or free as sometimes people like to think. We'll talk a minute more about that. So with those challenges, though, on the next slide, we have a few, key recommendations we'd like to make. One being, really considering how citizen science can fit into the scientific enterprise at the agency. It has outreach and education benefits. It serves those purposes, but it also has really great data collection potential, which we may not be taking full advantage of to really, complete our data collection. Another one is about making sure you're including the end users. And by this, we primarily mean like the stock assessment analyst scientists in the project design so that they can really speak to, the type of data, the type of collection protocols, how could that data be served to them that's useful? And also including the participants in the project design so they can say, what's a feasible type of activity for them to participate in if that seems like that's something they would like to do. So really, throughout the process, including all parties. Another one, and I'll speak to this more in the next slide, is really about designing projects to address data gaps. Also, as I mentioned, designing projects to ensure data quality, setting them up with the correct protocols, also knowing that those protocols are being handled correctly. There's things called, quality assurance plans that can be set up to go with citizen science projects. And that really just increases the trust from all parties. As I briefly mentioned, providing sufficient resources for citizen science. Talking to these project leads, it takes a lot of time to recruit people, to train people, constant involvement in some QA, QC and collecting data and checking back with them, communicating with your participants, managing the data, and then, doing that again the next year and the next year through continuous improvement. And so, while the participants may be unpaid, it doesn't mean that it doesn't require sufficient resources for these programs to be successful. And, a little bit on the last bullet, what we're kind of doing here about, educating and increasing awareness in the scientific community about the types of citizen science projects that could be useful. So on the next couple slides, I have a little more detail on what we're talking about with these data gaps. As I mentioned previously, we have some assessments that are data rich. They have really good data. An analyst may kind of hold the opinion of, if someone comes to me with this new fishing project that they've done, but it doesn't fit with like a need that I really have to improve my assessment, it may be of less interest to me because I have really good information. But there are a lot of assessments we have as an agency that are data moderate, data poor, and or have identified gaps and needs. And I kind of mentioned here a few places that people could look to find information on where some of the research needs and data gaps we have. We have, as Jeff mentioned, every stock assessment report has a section at the end that makes recommendations on things that could happen to improve the assessment for the next round. These are research recommendations. The councils, and I have a couple screenshots here to kind of show you what they look like, have research priorities that they put out every few years where they go through their different stocks and think of areas that they would appreciate more research to improve their management. The next one here, and I'll talk a minute on the next slide, is we actually did as an agency a couple years ago a data gap assessment where we looked at 5 categories of data, which are abundance, catch, size and age composition, life history, and ecosystem information. And we assigned, a target data level, like how much data would we love to have to assess this stock, and then what do we currently have? And that's kind of our data gap assessment. And I would just say that, it found that about 86% of our stocks had at least a data gap in one category, and about 50% had data gaps across 4 or 5 categories of data. But on the next slide, to kind of show that a little bit more, this is something we put out for our quarterly reports, a little detail on these data gaps in the categories. And to highlight here, we have the FSSI stocks, which for a little agency speak, that is our 175 selected fish stocks that we kind of select for their recreational, commercial, societal importance. It represents about 80% of catch in the US. And then non-FSSI stocks would be other stocks that we do manage. And you can see that even for the more important stocks, so they are doing better, there's still a majority that have data levels that are not yet meeting. And then, the levels of ones that have kind of gaps is even higher for the non-FSSI stocks. And this is across all categories. It's not just ecosystem or abundance. Even every category has improvements that could be made for different stocks. On the next slide, this kind of goes back to the analysis we did earlier that we mentioned about the research recommendations. But, this is also kind of thinking of how were the recommendations made. So you can see there's about half of the recommendations actually mentioned initiating a new type of citizen science project that could be useful to improving an assessment. And the other 3, incorporating or considering assessments, projects that are out there for citizen science, expanding upon a certain citizen science project could really also be used. So the kind of main takeaway from this here is there's a lot of potential for the emerging field of citizen science to be expanded and initiated and bring into some of our stock assessments. On the next slide here, and I won't go into too much detail, but just to give a little shout out, as Laura mentioned previously, to the South Atlantic Council that really did this systematic approach to designing their citizen science project program, which was like, they did a detailed process. They included stakeholders, including fishermen, stock assessment scientists, citizen science practitioners, and really looked through their stocks at like, what are some of the data that we need? what of those data that we need could potentially be matched with a citizen science project, and how would that look? And so, there's a lot more information on their website you can look into, but I kind of wanted to highlight that as the type of example of what we're talking about. All right. And now on the next slide, to finally kind of take it home and leave a few minutes for questions. Just finally, our key takeaways, citizen science does and can contribute quality data towards fisheries science and management. It's been shown that the data can be of equal quality if done correctly. We have many cases of citizen science contributing currently, but there's a lot more potential for its use than we are currently doing. So it's definitely an area for a lot of growth. As such, I think we would say it's important to increase our agency investment and participation in the implementation of these projects. Sometimes they are, ad hoc projects that come and go or of interest. And so, really kind of taking this strategic approach of how can citizen science fit into our entire data collection enterprise and projects, and where does it fit in appropriately? And, our last one, as I was previously discussing, is, making sure that we're really targeting these projects towards identified research needs and, cooperating. If I'm a person designing a project, making sure I'm cooperating with the end user of that data to make sure it's useful to them, it's collected in the way that's useful and formatted. So with that, I think our last slide here will be to thank you for your time. Those are just some links to our own NOAA Fisheries website if you want more information, and I believe we will hand it over for questions.
All right, thank you so much. This is Cassandra again from NOAA Library. We have some time to answer all of your questions. I will upload them for our speakers. Remember, when you submit questions, your first name will show up. You do have the option to ask questions anonymously if you choose so. From Sandy, are you using traditional / indigenous knowledge at all? Where might that be most promising?
I'll go briefly, and maybe Laura has more to say. I wouldn't say that we found any particular detailed cases that I can give you really detailed information on this. I think, yes, as I mentioned, this way of methodologies for kind of using historical reconstructions based on local knowledge, which is something that's useful to fisheries. I'm not sure if Laura is aware of more examples.
I would add, I'm just checking on my tech. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Great. I know that there have been examples in the ecosystem status reports, and I could put some links in the chat where I know that traditional ecological knowledge has been used, and it was particularly useful during the pandemic when, again, a lot of our normal survey exercises were not underway. I don't know if the question could also be in the context of when traditional ecological knowledge is also under the umbrella of citizen science. So I'd have to probably look more into that and be happy to follow up with some more specific examples in that context. But it's a great question, and one I think we could dive a little more into with a little time.
Just to add on to what you both already said, in going through a lot of the examples and the cases in part of our text analysis, I think the place where it was most directly referenced was in the Alaska region, and for some of the stocks there. I think one of their broader recommendations was to start using more traditional knowledge especially in cases where they have stocks that have, less data available.
Our next question is from Claude. Have any studies assessed if end user buy-in increased when their own data is being incorporated?
I think I will answer in this way. I think the end user, they actually mean the stakeholders, like as perhaps the fishing industry or recreational fishermen more interested if their own data is being utilized. I would assume there is some evidence and study of that. I can't point to a specific study that we have that says that argument in particular. I'm not sure if either of you guys, I'm not sure there's been any like we studied before and after and things like that.
Yeah, I'd say it wasn't really a focus of our queries of the NOAA fisheries side of things, because that's really looking at outcomes, not so much kind of that more academic side of things in the project space. I think Some of the literature did speak to that, but kind of more so in broad terms than in specific ones. I think maybe the most relevant thing I can remember was that there were a number of cases where stakeholder data was misused as part of the process. And I can tell you that definitely did the exact opposite of what you had asked about. It definitely decreased the interest in stakeholders engaging with, the fisheries management process and the scientists there.
Our next question is from Julia. Did you see regional differences across the U.S. in the use/consideration of the CITSI in assessments?
Do you want to go, Jeff, based on the reports?
Yeah, I was going to say, off the top of my head, honestly, it's been a minute since I looked into the spreadsheet, so I don't exactly remember, but I'm happy to if you shoot me an email, I can just send you the spreadsheet we've got, and you can take a direct look at what the numbers were and how they broke down.
I would just say, and this is more anecdotal, I think we see more references to citizen science, perhaps in, the Southeast, which has a very large recreational fishing community and recreational fisheries. So there's a lot more interest in getting, data from that segment of the population and is currently being used from existing projects. I think whenever there's also fisheries that have less data, to our point, maybe reef fisheries in the territories, or, the Southeast as well. I mean, I think there's also more references to the potential for citizen science in those types of fisheries. But we did find examples across all types of regions and fisheries.
Our next question: what do you think are the highest value opportunities for integrating citizen science into stock assessments to make them more sensitive to changing climate and ecosystem conditions?
Let's see, this is off the top of my head. Or did you have something you wanted to jump in real quick?
I was going to say, I think the most powerful thing that citizen scientists can offer would just be, their own observations, things about like fish distribution, especially as species distribution start to shift in response to warming waters. I mean, NOAA Fisheries maintains a pretty extensive surveying fleet, but we're only in one place at one time on varying occasions. Think about the power of having all of the various fishers and anglers out there on the water, making those observations and providing them. I think that could be an invaluable resource if we can find a better way to take advantage of it.
All right. Next question. Does NOAA partner with NGOs on these projects? If so, what upcoming opportunities are there?
Can probably dive in on that one. Yes, there are a number of examples where NGOs partner. I'm going to put a link in the chat to our NOAA inventory of citizen science projects that is on citizenscience.gov. So you can kind of comb through some of those projects for some examples. I don't know if there's an open call. It's usually on a case-by-case basis. What drives the citizen science project? What's the need for the partners? But I'd be hard-pressed to identify any citizen science project at NOAA that doesn't involve one or more partners, many of which, include NGOs. So I'll put that link to the inventory in the chat.
All right. Next question. Are you aware of any citizen science efforts for high school age youth that involve data literacy using fisheries data? For example, we are attempting to use the Cal-COFI data sets to help youth learn how to do time series analysis.
I can speak to some programs that certainly involve high school age students. I think there's a program, Limpets, on the West Coast, which is, again, it's a little more region specific, that's involves students in data collection in coastal areas. And when it comes to fisheries data, one example that I don't know that was targeted specifically for this case, but has been used, are online projects like Ocean Eyes, which are on Zooniverse. When they're combing the message boards, oftentimes high school teachers, or any teachers from any level, usually chime in with questions with a student seeking a project using that data. So it's not a firm process, but in many cases, projects transpire through those message boards where the scientists are monitoring them for questions, and many educators go to them through that avenue. I'll also put the link to Limpets in the chat as well.
Our next question is, mobile apps weren't mentioned very often in the assessment reports. Do you think this is because it is becoming more common to use apps, or because apps were being developed, but it was hard to get people to adopt them?
I'll let Jeff go first, though he may not have the anecdotal conclusion.
Yeah, maybe it's hard to say specifically any one thing about why apps were or were not really used here. I might say more, and this is just me kind of conjecturing on it, but I would say that right now the app landscape is very diverse. There's a lot going on out there, and it's hard to specifically identify like particular data that those apps are providing or species that they're targeting. I know that there's iSnapper out there, and that's very targeted, but I think the programs that we were looking at and the things that were kind of captured in our efforts, really we're looking at targeted data collection for specific purposes rather than kind of broader applications like apps are.
And I would say, and I don't mean this in any way to be critical of the apps. I think they have a lot of potential to be super useful, but there are so many and they're kind of trying different things. And I think this point that we're trying to make about the bridge of, really like connecting your project with the end user from the beginning, everybody's kind of participating the whole time. And it takes a few years too. So the project may have started recently, but it's going to take a few years before that makes it into an assessment and other things like that. So we are very much as an agency working with a lot of app programs and developers. And I think it's still just kind of in the early phases, but also, yeah, to Jeff's point of making sure that they are collecting targeted data that's really useful to the assessment.
What are your thoughts on utilizing citizen science tools like SciFish to build rapport and improve public perception of federal fisheries management? And then it looks like the question continues on in the next panel. For example, in the Southeast US, the general sentiment among private offshore anglers is to not openly share information with feds because it will, quote, be used against them, i.e. shutting down fisheries.
I think there's a lot of things that were mentioned by our analysts in terms of what they'd be most interested in getting from the recreational sector is things like discards, the type of lengths. It wasn't so much necessarily the total catch or the exact areas that everyone is fishing in, which, may be of slightly more skepticism from the fishing industry. So I think, the types of data that are really useful to improve the assessment is what we were really looking at, not so necessarily what's, the catch records that may be used for regulations, perhaps. But I think we also want people to feel that the data that they are collecting is useful and is being used. We also don't like scenarios where people are doing a lot of projects collecting data and then feel like it's not used. That's also something we're trying to avoid. So,
yeah, I was going to chime in as well. I think it's less specific to the tool and a little more driven by best practices. I think, if somebody contributes data and then they never hear where it went, was it used, how was it used? So I'd say it's less about the tool and more about that feedback cycle, that, application of, communication is invaluable for and necessary for effective citizen science. And how easy is the tool to use? So I guess I would steer away from the tool only to the extent does the tool make communication easier? Is it easier to use? Only to that extent. But I think it's more about best practices.
Yeah, and just to chime in, I think in looking across a lot of what we saw in current stock assessments, a lot of the data that are being considered and used right now are very discrete kind of one-off studies, other than things like tagging studies, which go on over time. And when you think about, I think one of the early slides that Laura had mentioned, there's kind of different classifications of citizen science. A lot of those fall into that first category where it's just using citizen scientists to collect data and that's it. And I think, the opportunities really start to emerge as these projects take root, as they grow and kind of have more of a time series to them and more buy-in. And you get to those phases where you're doing co-creation, where the stakeholders can really feel like they get some buy-in, that are providing some of the hypotheses and idea, as well as projects that really are kind of more fully integrating the perspectives of stakeholders and scientists when trying to kind of co-manage the resource almost and co-steer the science. rather than kind of the more traditional structure, which is kind of entirely led by the stock assessment scientists.
That is the end of our Q&A portion of the seminar. Any last comments, Rebecca?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that if you are interested in any of the other sessions from our webinar series, they are all on the Citizen Science playlist for the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel. If you have any questions about anything you heard today, or if you want any information about the Citizen Science program at NOAA, feel free to email citizenscience@noaa.gov. And our next webinar series is going to be on October 17th at 3 p.m. We will be featuring Brendan Turley, who is a current NOAA employee, but he formerly did a fellowship with the Thriving Earth Exchange. And he will be speaking about the work he did making community playgrounds safer by removing recycled tires and some of the collaborative work he did with other agencies in the area. So feel free to turn in then on October 17th, and we'll have a registration email coming out to our community of practice about that shortly. That's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending today. We hope to see you at our next seminar.